a Q&A session now. We'll just be taking questions and comments from the audience. And if you indicate that you'd want to ask a question, let me know, or just look at me and I'll take you in the order that I see you. Shannon?
Yes. Well, there's one right here. Is that working? Okay. Anyone on the panel or all of you can answer this question. The basic theme of this conference has been trying to bridge whatever divide there may be between the military and civilian world. Well, that's part of it. But in that context, I'm wondering, are there programs that attempt to improve education in the civilian world about returning warriors and what they need and what society owes them? And I mean that in the best sense, you know, what society ought to be proud to provide. And I guess if any of you could comment on that and perhaps expand on it, if that's another area that we can explore for civil-military cooperation.
The Naval Institute, in cooperation with the Military Officers Association of America, puts on a forum in Washington once a year. And for the past 3 years, we've done it on Are We Keeping Faith? Wounded warriors and their families. And the reason is, and I'll bang on this a lot, we're at a strategic inflection point. We have not been here before in this manner, in this degree, with this much understanding, and with this much stress on the system. In her system, there are not yet enough caregivers, workers around, and they're working to bring them because in years past, shell shock wasn't something you treated. Now it's not shell shock, okay? I had a guy standing up the other day giving a lecture at our Defense Forum, Washington. He was a soldier in his chocolate chips, looking great, sounding great, until halfway through you recognize he only had one leg. But that wasn't the end of the story. As the late Paul Harvey says, here's the rest of the story. The rest of the story is he had just come back from his second combat tour in Iraq as the commanding officer of a cavalry squadron, and he was the first soldier in the history of the United States military to be returned to full active duty as a wounded warrior with a prosthesis. He'd passed all the tests, done all the physical things required, and his laughter was, he was kind of funny about it. He said, okay, here it is. What you got to worry about now, and he was looking at folks because we had a huge audience, among them the Secretary of Veterans Affairs and a bunch of other folks. He said, what you got to figure out is, what kind of disability are you going to give me when I retire from the Army? Because I'm on full active duty, but I only got one leg. And you haven't ever been there before. And it's a practical application. So it is uncharted territory for an all-volunteer force that's overstressed, for the Guard and Reserve that's overstressed. I had a dialogue with some folks at lunch. 200,000 people come out of the military services every year, whether they want to or not, peacetime or war. They're looking for the next chapter in their life, whether they're injured, whether they're healthy, and if they find that it's not available to them, then the word will get back. And my thesis in all of this is, if America wants an all-volunteer force, then we need to do what all of these folks have talked about times 10. We have got to be engaged, and it's not easy.
Any of the other panelists like to?
We get a lot of inquiries from civilian churches who want to know if there are resources out there, and we try to partner with them. The Army Chief of Chaplain's office is doing more of that because a lot of the folks they deal with are reservists and guardsmen who are deployed, sometimes just one of them from an area with another unit someplace far away. They're with that unit in combat. They develop these strong bonds and relationships. Then they come back. They go back to their home station. They're the only person in that whole community who went to that particular deployment. They have nobody around to support them. And some of these civilian pastors want to know, well, how do we deal with that? How do we help these people who show, what do we look for in terms of post-traumatic stress and combat stress? And if we do find it, is there anything we can do? I mean, there are a lot of people asking those kind of questions. I don't know if there's any integrated program per se. I hear about programs all the time. I read the papers. You know, people out there trying to do things to help soldiers. And sometimes it's just simple things. I mean, in the 30 years I was in the military, I never had anybody offer to buy me lunch. I'm staying in Moe's restaurant about a year ago, and I get up to the cash register. I'm with another service member. We're standing there, and we said, we're pulling out our money to pay. And the clerk says, oh, you don't have to pay anything. That person who went through ahead of you paid for you. So, I mean, there's things like that happening. I think there's a different kind of atmosphere than, let's say, post-Vietnam when I first came in the Army.
But still no integrated.
Not that I'm aware of.
And it makes me wonder if there shouldn't be some more nationwide effort. We do educational programs on a lot of issues. Maybe there needs to be something really top-down about these issues instead of piecemeal.
I was going to comment the same thing. I don't know of a structured program like you're talking about, but locally I get calls often to speak to groups, very similar to the topic I spoke to, say to a group of employers or that kind of thing that want to know more about how to get involved and some of the challenges that people are facing when they're coming back, and especially employers, very enlightened to know that some of these, employees may have a VA disability, or they may still be a reservist, or they may be having problems in X, Y, and Z, but they're still a good employee, if not better, because of their military experiences. So, I mean, I see it very slowly on a local level, but I think that, there could be just more awareness, for the general population.
And there's got to be a national undertaking, and part of the reason is we had a dialogue this morning on Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Well, let me give you chapter 2 of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I'm looking for a job. I don't feel good, but I'm not going to tell anybody, because as soon as you interview me for the job and someone finds out that I've spoken to anybody about having some kind of stress factor from my recent combat experiences, and you're looking at 3 other people who are lined up to get that same job, and all of them have been in the civilian community the entire time and have resumes, which one are you going to pick? And by the way, if I'm just a serviceman or woman, and maybe I haven't had any problems, but I've been in the military and been in the war zone, do I have the same opportunity then in your eyes as a small business person? I'm not talking about the people who hire tons of folks. I'm talking about folks who depend on everybody in their business. And they're looking to hire. Where will they go? And if, by the way, I do have stress and have said something, then what does that do for me as well? So the challenges, and one of the things, there was a doctor from the Mayo Clinic who was at our last conference, and here's what you're looking at. Sitting next to me was a guy named Jack Jacobs. Some of the soldiers might know who Jack Jacobs is. Jack is on MSNBC News. Jack is a contemporary of mine and a good friend, won the Medal of Honor, earned the Medal of Honor in Vietnam, doing things that just defy description. Little guy, great sense of humor. They're still pulling metal out of that guy every day. And he's got half of a head that's got sheet metal in it, and he rings off detectors everywhere he goes. And so the Mayo Clinic guy was talking, and Jack was Donna. He was the moderator for the panel. And so he just turned around and said, see, what we're really talking about here is 60 years, and this guy is still kicking, which means we're obligated to provide care. And so now we have a generation of veterans, several generations. If you look at the range of ages from the Guard and Reserve who are older to the youngsters who are first-termers. And we have to gear up to care for them for that entire terminal undertaking. That's not an easy drill, and if that's in a strategic inflection point in the way we do these things, there probably isn't one.
Chaplain Simpson, do you want to comment on
No,
this?
it's just
You okay?
wrapped.
All right, thank you. Yes, you want to introduce yourself? Did you
I'm
introduce
Wilkes.
yourself?
Ms. Price mentioned that a lot of soldiers, when they come back, they have this.
Tell me who you are.
Sean Wilkes, from the United States Army.
From?
United States Army.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, a bad hearing.
Roger. Ms. Price mentioned that a lot of soldiers, when they come back, they have this sort of lost sense of direction. And I'm wondering, from the university's standpoint, from the standpoint of the academy, what can universities be doing, A, to better draw these people in, sort of give them a sense of direction, provide them with opportunities like that, draw them into the university for education or for job opportunities and whatnot. And then B, when they do get here, if they do get, here for educational purposes or anything else, What kinds of things should the universities be doing in terms of providing care, mental care, spiritual care, and that sort of thing that they don't or they might not be prepared to because they've been, set up to really, bring in soldiers or bring in, 18 to 24-year-old people from, regular civilian life.
Sure. I don't know across the board what other schools are doing, but I know where the VA hospital where I work is about a mile down the road from Middlesex Community College, and they've started a veterans resource center, again, just to have a place for any veteran that, doesn't matter if they're combat or not, to just stop in, and it's manned by volunteers that are veterans in their student population, and basically it's just a drop-in center with resources, veterans resources, all kinds of mental health, education resources, and it's supposed to be part of the student services, but also just a part of the campus for people, again, to find some commonality. So I don't know if that's something that other schools have. I haven't heard if there is.
Do you want to?
Sure. I'm right now involved in a program that might interest you. The Walmart, believe it or not, put up several $1 million. Walmart put up several $1 million to colleges and universities to compete for. Not a single Ivy competed. But we had 245 colleges respond in the United States. And it is quite amazing to read through what they would like to do. Now, obviously, these people can't all be funded, but 245 colleges, I have the signatures of 245 college presidents. This wasn't just some place down in the bowels of the college, have signed an application that says they want to improve their veteran services. And I would guess, I don't know exactly, I've read them all, but I would guess that 130 or 140 of them had specific things in them about the kid that might have PTSD or something like that, and exactly what their plan would be to get them over to the college mental health facility, and how much time they could allot to that. So I guess there's a hopeful sign here. It seems to me that if we could get out to colleges and universities, the word that this is the right thing to do. I know the American Council on Education has done this, really tried to get out the idea that you could do better with veterans, basically. And if we could find ways to incentivize it, this is just a very modest program I'm talking about, and yet look at the response. So the fact of the matter is, I can tell you specifically a half a dozen colleges in the United States that have strong programs for wounded warriors, very strong programs for wounded warriors. This is starting to happen out there. And one of the reasons I came here, in fact, I'll talk to you tomorrow, is that I'm kind of amazed that none of the Ivies were interested in this. That all of the people who responded to these things were your community colleges and kind of your state colleges and university level people. The Ivies could do a hell of a lot better than they have, and we already have one indicator here that shows that they need to get up on the step.
Yeah, and I think it's a partnership. So I've worked closely with the people that are developing that program at Middlesex. So if they have a veteran coming in that doesn't quite know how to navigate the VA system, they'll link them directly with me, so they have someone to kind of walk them through it. And plus, we have an opportunity with schools because you have to have health insurance to be a student, and the VA is free. So if we can hook them in that way, and at least get them to sign up and come in for a primary care, I know they're going to get screened for PTSD and depression and substance abuse and traumatic brain injury. So I think it's a very positive relationship to have.
Sean, did you have something in mind?
No, I was curious what the thoughts were, especially from mental health and children's point of view, is what needs to be there on campuses that aren't.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yes, you were next, and then you will follow, and then Rob.
Thanks, Liz. John Wilkerson, this is for you. I'm Chaplain Eric Wester from National Defense University. Building on your analogy of Intel, in which the strategic inflection point resulted in an organization that tore down its core engine, to use your word, and rebuild. And your frequent references to an all-volunteer force. Is the direction that you see the inflection heading toward mandatory national service?
I don't see it headed that way in the sense it's mandatory. But since you touch a nerve, one of the things that I've shared with some of you, and it's something that I think is going to have some value. When I talk to people around the country, one of the things that I talk about is, if your citizenship is free, does it have any value? And one of the examples I give is that in the last decade, we have had the largest rise in first-generation Americans in our history, 30 million people. 30 million people. And not coincidentally, if you like trivia, that's the increase that we've had in our population in that decade. The only increase. There has been no increase because of those who were second generation and beyond. When my mother and dad, were they to be sitting down at a table like this with contemporaries from World War II, whether they were African Americans, Asian Americans, and said, "What did you do in the war?" Every person at the table would have been able to say what they did, whether they had no education or whether they were from Harvard, whether they had no money or whether they were from one of the wealthiest families in the country. I made a victory garden. I was Rosie the Riveter. I was at Guadalcanal. I was at Normandy. I built airplanes. I flew the damn airplanes to the war for somebody else. I talked to several women who were ferry pilots in World War II. My point is, I'm not interested in having World War III to have that kind of common cause amongst Americans. But without it, I fear for the Republic. And the answer has to be some form, in my judgment, of national service. Not necessarily in the military, but national service, so that when we sit at this table in future generations, we won't know any better than to say, how did you earn your citizenship? I earned it by working with the local fire department as a volunteer. I earned it in the Red Cross. I earned it as a VA volunteer. I earned it in Job Corps, Peace Corps, you name it. But I earned it. And it cost us 2 years of our life. Used the Mormon model, and I'm not a Mormon. My point about that is, if you don't do that, then what you really are risking as you go along is this continued separation that we see now between the military and those who support the military. Supporting the military is not a damn bumper sticker that you put on your car and kiss it off. And it is not being really ready, because there are so many non-governmental agencies, so many community agencies who want to help, but there's a lot of inhibition because of legal problems. You just don't touch somebody who has mental health problems if you're a community college unless you are really locked in well with the folks who are supposed to be providing it. It is not something that is a feel-good you can do. Let me give you the extreme stupidity example. Some NGOs were with me at our last conference, and they were railing at the department because in accordance with the ethics laws, all you ethics students here, right? You can buy me for $35. I'm a general officer. You can't spend more than that. So if a young Lance Corporal in the Army and his family cannot make their home payment and he is in recovery mode, there is no mechanism for a nonprofit to provide funds to support them because they can't give them that much money. You're buying them. And they're now changing, Senator Webb and several other veterans in the Congress are changing those laws to give enough latitude, strategic inflection point, so that you can address an issue you've never had to address before. So if you ask me what I'd like to see, yeah. But I also bet you that sooner or later we're going to have to consider it, because it's the only way, in part, to keep America as common cause, and it's also something else. It'll keep us from going to war too damn often. War is the court of last resort, and I'll get off my soapbox. We have tried to make war into something antiseptic and surgical, and that's not only stupid, it's a lie. When you decide to go to war, and those of you who've been in combat can acknowledge this. It isn't about the ethics. It's about the fact that you break things. The difference between all the new things the military learns how to do are nice to know. But we have a military for one reason only. The only unique thing that the military contributes to the republic's existence, and that is if you finally can't do anything else and it's time to break things, they're the only way you can turn to. And they have to be good at it, because we haven't seen the last of war, and we haven't seen the last of people who don't like our American way of life. So in the last analysis, what we have to do is not do it so often. Be more prone to do perhaps some of the initiatives that the new administration has undertaken, so that when you finally get back to ground zero and say, okay, we've got to do this, it takes the Congress and the American people and a commitment that is more than a bumper sticker before you launch into this thing. And most importantly, as an American, I want to know what the goal is. So in the end, I know when to stand up and cheer. You don't have to like unconditional surrender. But when Roosevelt said that's what it is, you have a hard time misinterpreting it. It's pretty easy to understand. Now I'm off my soapbox.
Anybody else want to address this? Okay, thank you. You're next. Introduce yourself, please.
Thank you. I'm Shanta Bahan. I'm a chaplain and bereavement counselor for a hospice company and a chaplain for a college in the area. And I was actually wondering how service persons are trained in the course of their, or how they're educated in the course of their training to recognize some of the signs and symptoms of combat stress or reentry stress, so that it might not be the social worker or the person who's meeting them for the first time, but maybe they can see a little bit more of those symptoms and can maybe address them proactively. Thank you.
The Army has a pretty extensive program training at all different levels. I mean, from the soldier that comes right into the Army enlisted all the way up through senior officers. I even believe it's an annual training requirement, but I'm not sure of that. But I know even at the Chaplain Center in school, of course, you would think that we would do it because we're in that domain. But I know that some of the programs that we use are not designed just for chaplains; they're designed for soldiers in general. And there are several different things out there. Last couple of years, for example, I know we brought every single chaplain assistant, member of the staff and faculty in a year ago just to talk about mild traumatic brain injury and talk about this, symptomology of that and how, what to do and how to recognize it in yourself and how to recognize it in your buddy. In the Army, we depend a lot on the buddy system. They're trained all the way through, to have a battle buddy, we call it. And even in chaplain school, we do that. And the idea is that you can sometimes recognize things more quickly than somebody else because you're there. When I was a chaplain overseas, I can think of several instances where soldiers were prevented from committing suicide, not by chaplains, but by the soldiers that were friends there who said, we need to go talk to the chaplain, or we need to go talk to somebody, and they intervened. If it had not been for a friend who recognized that when somebody was giving away his entire CD collection, that was probably a bad sign, then that person may have gone out and successfully completed suicide. But thanks to a friend who said, gee, why are you doing that? And could recognize a sign of hopelessness that was there, could get that person to get help. So that I think the Navy probably has a similar program.
I could say nobody does this like Marines, but actually nobody does, in a sense. Marines are very big on taking care of one another. And in several different versions of different kinds of trainings, it's always about paying attention to who's there, who isn't there, how they're behaving. It's a sad thing that oftentimes it can be overlooked because of the pressures of the mission and getting things accomplished and worrying about those kinds of things, and that's very distracting. And when you're deploying as fast and trying to get everybody trained and prepared, it's a hard thing to do, but we still remind the Marine that the best friend he has is the Marine next to him, and the one who can do the most for him and the one he can do the most for is the one next to him. In the Navy, it's a different system because of the structure, the way commands are put together. But when we do, at least on the suicide training and some of the others, we do talk we're getting into this system now instead of these long, convoluted cryptograms, we're getting it down to 3 letters finally. Ask, contact somebody, and take the person. Do not leave them alone. If you have any concerns at all, don't be afraid to ask. And we're trying to get people, we've got a suicide prevention video that deals with the idea of the moral courage to ask the tough question. And sometimes the tough question is the one you don't want to ask because of what it's going to mean for you, because once you ask, you become that person's caretaker until they're handed off to a professional. And that's a heavy responsibility. But at the same time, we're trying to help people realize, the chaplain's maybe not even on board, so who are you going to talk to? So we try to make it a family affair.
Thank you. So a speaker who was interested in coming and was not able to is Ed Tick, and I've been very impressed by his book, The War and the Soul. And one of the things that he brings up, and I would like to particularly respond to a comment you made, but ask for general ideas or broader beyond, is that for the society to understand the true costs of war, the stories of the people who've lived through it have to become common knowledge. And it would seem that there is some therapeutic benefit to that. I'm looking for if there are models or guidelines for helping those conversations happen in ways that are safe, don't re-traumatize, ideally would not cause vicarious trauma, and yet honor the experience so that throughout society there is this instinct for respecting those who have been there.
That's a hard drill because it's the most important thing is community. Marines take care of Marines because I can talk to a Marine. I talk to a Marine about things I don't talk to my wife about. Yet they might be just as emotionally have an impact as anything that's ever gone on. But I have common cause with those I served, what we went through together. You can read it in books. It's a different kind of love. It's you can ask soldiers who've been there in this combat as well as those that have been before. It's easy to say, it's difficult to do. And with only a small fraction of the entire country directly involved, and that includes their families and perhaps even their towns, it makes it geometrically more difficult. Half the time, I don't want anybody to be giving me anything except to let me be part of the community and be under the radar, me being the returning service person, okay? The other half the time when I need help, there's really nobody there. The example of the guardsman who was with a unit far away but then returned to his home place, there's no one to go to. What you're up against is the issue of how does the nation go to war? I mean, you go to any community in World War II or Korea, and it wasn't a problem. There were other problems. It's not like it was pretty, but everybody was involved. And today everybody is involved in a different way. The communications capability of the nation, I have this little deal. What's the difference between a firefight and a hot firefight? A firefight's when they're shooting at you. A hot firefight's when they're shooting at me. Okay, well, in World War II, there are some tremendous examples of huge combats where casualties were, how many did I lose? Not how many of the enemy I killed, what was the body count? Today, what we have, we're up around 4,000 and change. And we probably can find the name of every one of them because the entire nation knows. Whereas in World War II, only in the little communities did you know because they sent telegrams. So the difference in communication has changed awareness, but it hasn't changed our ability to integrate. And we just got to shake it out and see how it comes. There are going to be some success stories we haven't thought about. And there are going to be some hiccups that we'll police up with people who are professionals like these folks. And we won't know till after the fact. The best thing that can happen to us, though, in my judgment, is if the nation is committed to warfare as the last resort, and then the nation is involved and everybody has skin in the game. Then we won't go messing around with this thing like it was free. And that, to me, that's the biggest thing I see, and that's why I was talking about national service. The biggest concern I have is not whether we should be in Afghanistan or should be in Iraq, but rather we, the collective citizenry of America, should then be there. And we should know what we're there for and know when to stand up and cheer. And it wasn't until President Obama got up the other day and said, okay, here's what we're going to do in Afghanistan, that we actually really had a clear picture. There's a story in one of Bob Woodward's books. I don't know if you know him. He's the guy who writes for Washington Post. He also did the Watergate scandal and a bunch of other things. Well, in the middle of one of his books, in the middle of the Bush administration, and this isn't an indictment on any individual, this is just what goes on. They're sitting at a cabinet meeting, and they brought in the Secretary of Treasury to be a sanity check. And they started talking about what they were going to do in Iraq. And his question when he got through is, why are we doing that? For what? And you looked around the cabinet room, and there was dead silence. And each guy, when they finally figured it out, had a different answer. Well, you don't have a lot of interpretation in unconditional surrender. There are words you can use, and it doesn't have to be those. But my point is, they have to be words that we all recognize. So if she's the president, and she says them, and she leads the nation, and then it's just like being at Coca-Cola. Everybody knows why we have Coca-Cola. Everybody knows why we're at war there and what we're going to do, and when we finish, when we're going to stand up and cheer and bring the folks home and take care of them. You can't get there from here unless you have that. That's a long answer to a short question. They taught me how to do that in the military. See, when you get through, then they go, what did he say?
Elizabeth, did you?
Sure. When you were saying how can we bring awareness, that's pretty much what you're talking about in your question?
It's twofold. I think we need awareness, but
Yeah.
I think that's also need to be able to tell the story.
Right. And I know I said this a few times when I was speaking, that I hear a lot of times people don't get it. They ask me ridiculous, inappropriate questions about things that I've been through and not really understanding. And I was hearing this often. I was able to support veterans with this. And then I started talking to my own friends who are also non-military and highly educated people, and realizing that they didn't even get what I do for work, right?
There you go.
And, we had one friend in my group of friends deploy with a reserve unit. And I don't think it ever occurred to the rest of the group that he was carrying a weapon and probably shot and killed multiple people. It was as if it never occurred to them. And I think it's this thing that we see on the news, and it's so abstract for a lot of folks, and that's the reality of it. And that's been a real interesting eye-opener for me. And I think that, as was described, there's this battle mind presentation to train soldiers on how to recognize when that battle mind isn't working anymore in civilian life. And there's a video that goes along with that, and it's little vignettes. And for an example, there's a vignette that shows a young soldier who had probably recently come back, and he's going to a picnic with a friend, and he's packing his bag, and you see him put a handgun in his bag. And then his friend slams the trunk, and the veteran goes into a flashback. And it gives what a flashback might look like to someone. And then it kind of zooms out, and it shows the veteran jump in the truck, slam the door, and speed off, and then get pulled over. And a lot of the veterans, the groups that we show this video to with these post-deployment reassessments, they kind of giggle through it. But it gives some sense of what that might be like for people. And it talks about how, in the war zone, you always have a weapon. You always have a weapon. That's what keeps you safe. Do you need that when you're going on a picnic? The threat level is probably really low, but that's an automatic response. That might be actually really dangerous at a picnic after a couple beers, right? And, that flashback, the veteran was instantly agitated and irritated and just sped off. So I think those kinds of tools should be really shown to anyone, everyone, not only family members, but other civilians and people in the world, to just get a glimpse, which I'm not sure how accurate those videos are, but I think they were developed by people that know. So That was the comment that I was thinking about.
They're going to have to figure out how to do some decompression time. One of the practical reasons they don't do it now, we don't have enough soldiers. The rotation's just ruining all of them. But a decompression time is a time when you can bring someone out of a combat situation still in the forward area, or at least away from the combat but not home, and make them bored, and get them settled down, and get them smoothed out, and get them antsy about, I really want to go home. Instead of zoom, boom, one flight out of Germany and you're home, and I'm looking at people I haven't seen in a while, and 2 days ago I was in a firefight where I saw some people blown up in an IED. The medical folks and the chaplains and the folks who are caregivers will figure that out. But right now, even if they knew what they could do, I'm not sure that the government would pull it off because of the cycle times that they're stuck with, because we don't have enough folks in uniform to handle what they're trying to do, which is a message.
What we do for our students who are our career corps students who, like I said, most of them have come back, 100% of them have come back from the war zone within a year. About 4.5 years ago, I put into the curriculum for them just a one-day off-site in a kind of a neutral location away from the campus. And ostensibly, I got them out there to talk to them about how they can recognize symptoms of combat stress, and just a reminder of how they can recognize combat stress in their soldiers that they work with. But there was also a double intent there. I had them go out there then also to spend some time telling each other their stories. And not everybody's going to respond the same way. Not everybody will respond at a certain time. So you've got to have multiple venues to allow them to vent. And we've had several, and then we do a worship service there for chaplains. And we've had, chaplains have made significant breakthroughs at that time away, telling stories to each other. And also learning, just being reminded about combat stress. But then really it was there to get them to talk to each other. It's been so successful, we've added another retreat at the end of their time. And all our instructors are trained to watch for those kinds of signs of stress. We had one student who we asked him to write about suffering and evil, was dragging his foot and didn't write the paper, So the small group leader called the student in and said, "What's with the paper?" And recognized some symptoms there, talked to the chaplain, got them to see a counselor, and they've been in counseling and working through the process ever since. But one of the biggest things is just and I think we're doing better at this, is removing the stigma, like somebody mentioned earlier, of going to see someone when you have a problem. And the Army is trying to make a big thing about it. It's taking care of yourself and taking care of your friends or your buddy. When a real strong person is the person who goes to get help, not the person who covers it up and doesn't seek it. Another thing that there's been interest in, and we haven't pursued this yet, is I've been approached by veterans, a couple of veterans through the VA system, who from past wars, who are interested in meeting with soldiers of the present conflict and talking with them. And I think there's probably a lot of value in that. As they talk to each other about the stories from different generations and find out their stories in many ways have some connections and similarities. And the thing about that is they can talk to each other about those things that someone who hasn't been there, as John Wilkerson talked about, couldn't understand.
They're archetypal, those stories.
Yeah.
Shannon.
Well, just kind of building on all of this, when we did the PDTC for the Navy Marine Corps chaplains in 2006, one of the pieces of that was not only, we certainly had a section on warrior transitions and wounded warriors in this issue, but the other thing that we brought in, because in our test run, they do a test run before they launch the thing, so many issues came up, was care for the caregivers, that the chaplains themselves had various kinds of needs arising from caring for veterans that were not necessarily being addressed, and the chaplains had trauma that was not being addressed. And I was thinking about you as a social worker, and that we were saying earlier how much more support we need to get up and running for our veterans. But as we do that, we're also adding to the pool of people who are exposed to all of this in a way that can actually create a secondary kind of trauma. And we forget about those people a lot. We forget about caring for the caregivers. but we need those people to deliver these services that are so essential. I just wondered if any of you wanted to comment on that at all. Do we overlook the ones who give the care?
Well, this program that I was talking about that we do with our students is oriented towards chaplains as a part of that component. We have a program down at the Army Medical Center and School that is designed to help talk about this whole thing, care to the caregivers, and our current chief of chaplains is very much committed to making that an issue with chaplains and chaplain assistants. And I know the medical folks are also dealing with this. So I think it has been something that has increasingly gotten more concern and more effort towards it. And that's the whole reason that the Army Chief of Chaplains stood up the Center for Spiritual Leadership. It's really focused towards helping chaplains, chaplain assistants, to deal with the burnout that sometimes comes from caring for others so much. And like I said, it's not necessarily even related to the combat. They didn't even have to be in the combat zone themselves. They could be just listening to stories from soldiers who've come back, and by hearing those stories over and over and over again, experience a certain level of stress that's there. And that's everywhere in the force. It's not just for even people who don't deploy. The stress level in the military, most people would say, is up because we all hear those stories and we're all dealing with those things all the time. Yeah.
On the Navy side, we're building in, and we started a little while ago, building into the basic course this concept of care for the self or care for the caregiver, that we're trying to integrate it into the basic understanding of what a military chaplain is, that they do a lot of different kinds of care, and some of it is on the extreme level or very extremely intense, so that they need to make sure that they are taking advantage of the opportunities to take care of themselves. And we do these care for the caregivers with each of our programs, the basic course, the supervisor course, and the senior supervisor course. And we did a PDTC not too long ago on it as well. So we're trying to make sure that it's not just something it's nice to do, it's really kind of mandatory, because if you don't do that, you won't be a full up round, as we say, for yourself or anybody else.
Elizabeth, do you want to comment on that from your experience?
Sure. I mean, I think, we're taught in school you're only as good to someone else as long as you're taking care of your own stuff. And I think that the secondary and vicarious trauma could certainly needs to be acknowledged if you're hearing people's stories all day. But, one of the things that I talk about with people all the time is really good self-care. So I think that's something that I have to make sure that I do for myself and have some sort of outlet for myself to make sure that I'm, not going to burn out after a short time.
Before I move to you, I just want to make a note about Judith Herman, who is a local. Dr. Judith Herman, who's a local trauma guru here, and just to emphasize your point, Roz, that she claims that there's 3 stages of recovery from trauma. First is creating safety with the person. Second is telling the story. And the third is reintegration into the community. And her research has been, she conducted her research with returning Vietnam veterans, with other major trauma victims, and it was consistent across trauma, the particular types of trauma, that this, in particular, this need to tell the story. And it just seems to me that's a pretty easy thing to do. Creating the safety might be the more challenging aspect of it, but I just love your idea of some mechanism, some public mechanism for those who want to do this, to be able to tell their story, maybe get the media involved in this. I mean, that might compromise the safety, but I think we have to take this one really seriously. Yes, you're next.
Hi, I'm Mickey Siegel from Advocates for ROTC. Thought I'd try to bring this a little concretely onto the topic of the title of the meeting of Ivies and the military, and ask specifically what sort of things we can recommend to Ivy League institutions that will work. One of the things that Sean Wilkes alluded to before was the general studies program at Columbia, which tends to bring people back after normal college age and bring them to a top college. Other sorts of things happen very informally. For instance, there was a few years ago, there was a Harvard student who was wounded, and one of the parents of somebody got in touch with an alumnus who emailed the president of Harvard, who then got in touch with him in the hospital and so forth. And things like this happen sort of without a process. They just happened because people cared. And when people come back, there's something of a network of people who connects them into sort of what was going on and where they would be if they hadn't been there and so forth. But what kinds of ways can we take a community where the representation of people with military experience is low, and how can we compensate for those low numbers with some of the real advantages of these communities to make it so if someone comes back to such an environment that they're getting something special?
One of the things that you might recognize but not be aware of is that absent Harvard undergraduate, there is a fairly consistent and large stream of military veterans who go to the B school, to law school, to the graduate schools, to courses that lead them to divinity practice and to religious professional careers and the like. The question is really, how does the Harvard leadership want to be part of what's the national entity? When you look back in history, 13 presidents have been from the Ivy League. And among those 13 are those who took us to the largest wars in our nation's history. The idea that the Ivies are not connected is kind of a red herring, a myth. It's just where they're connected. And where they've been connected is they prepare the leaders in the State Department and the Department of Defense and in the executive who make the decisions that take the military people to uniform people who are now volunteers to combat. One would think we would be able to find it in the Ivy Leagues without too much trouble, that given that history, it would be pretty easy for them to figure out how to let the volunteers who want to be soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines come to the college at the undergraduate level, to the university system at the undergraduate level, and then go on, even if there are only a few of them, because it would be a statement on the part of each one of the Ivies that we belong. My grandfather was Yale 10. He went on, when he graduated, to law school at Yale, Skull and Bones and all the other magic things that some of our previous presidents had belonged to. Only when he finished, there was a war going on. And so he enlisted in the Navy, and he went to the Western Front as an aircraft mechanic. Later became a congressman, just in case you want to know the rest of the story. But here's my point. My point is, what did he know? And what did Yale and Harvard and Dartmouth and the others know then that we don't know now? That would cause them to allow that to happen and for them to feel that obligation, and today not. Just to show you it's still alive at Harvard, for instance, the son of the chairman of my board is with SEAL Team 1 and has made one combat tour already, and he's a Harvard graduate. He didn't make a lot of noise about that when he was in basic training at SEALs at Buds on the West Coast. Kept that kind of quiet, but since he stands pretty high and swims pretty hard, it became pretty obvious that he was somebody special. The leadership has to make a decision. It's about leadership. It's that simple. It's about leadership.
I would say if you want to get these veterans together, make a Harvard Veterans Facebook page.
Make a Harvard
Facebook page.
Make a
Yeah.
Facebook page.
Anybody else?
I'd like to, but I'm afraid to be a diatribe.
Come on, we like those kind of comments. Please.
I'm Bob Davenport. I'm probably the oldest guy here now. I saw World War II coming, so I joined the ROTC and got into it, went over. My last serious try at service was Desert Storm. And the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Reserve Affairs was half my age. He about died. He was sitting beside me, said, I want to go. But he said, write me a letter. And of course, it was over. But we entered into this, we were attacked, and we said it comes from Afghanistan. We got our allies together, and we went in and did a job, started a job. And then the president looked over at Iraq, and he said, gee, he's a bad guy. We ought to, while we were at it, take him out. And when George Tenet said, weapons of mass destruction are slam dunk, I knew we were sunk. And the intelligence was faulty. So we prepared for it, and the chief of staff said, you need 400,000 men. And the administration said, well, we'll work it out. We're high-tech people. We don't need it. And as soon as you saw the first TV shots of the Iraqis running free in the streets, you knew we were in for a bad scene. They wanted their freedom, but they didn't know how to exercise it. Half the Iraqis had never seen freedom. So they needed to be protected, and we didn't protect them. And even though we have had a small casualty rate, every one of them has hit me hard. I've suffered a little bit of that. And that's why I'm still trying to do something that will help us get on the track. We need to get involved. I agree with you, General. We need to get people involved. We need to make the public understand we're part of it. They were not taxed. We didn't pay an extra tax for this war. They had no idea. Guns and butter. I've heard that before, and we don't have it. We can't have it and have a successful conclusion to our activity. So we have a lot to do, and that is the reason the Ivies, I think, one of the reasons, have rejected the ROTC. They said our leaders are wasting our youth, and we want to put a stop to it. The only way you can do it is say, you can't have them.
Those are leaders that we graduated from the Ivies.
Yes, they are. And we've put them into office. But this, you can see, this is not just a very simple thing. It's very complex. And those of us who have seen it going on, who have some understanding of it, can appreciate what's going on. I hope we can find a conclusion that will get our young people back in and be a participant in this fact. We're going to have horrendous medical expenses. This is going to be another thing. Do we have the stomach to pay for this? Because these people are coming back from the war, and the VA system is not doing a very good job. I'm a military retiree. I have a system that's almost as good as the congressmen have. But my buddy, who's a Marine, who I care for and take to the VA, is shunted aside and given good care, but it's delayed. It's really not sufficient. And I think we've got to find some way to make our medical system responsive. So we have to work on the front end to get things straightened out there, and then we have to take care of them on the rear end. I've said enough. Thank you.
Any comments?
I can't emphasize enough it's about engagement. Teddy Roosevelt said it. If you're not going to get in the arena and go after it, and don't fly under false colors. If you don't want to serve, don't make up an excuse why you don't want to serve. So if you're at Harvard or Dartmouth or somewhere, don't say it's because we won't let gays in the military or that. If what you really mean is, I just don't want them here, then say it. And live with the consequences of your decision. And what I'm getting at is the accountability that I spoke about when we made Raz an ensign today. We live and die on that in the military. We're accountable. You run your ship aground, tough break, you're out of here. Ernie King. World War II, Fleet Admiral King had one of his pets run a ship aground, and his staff came to him complaining, saying, "Don't take his career. You know he's terrific, and he wasn't even on the bridge when the ship ran aground." And his answer was, "I don't want any unlucky captains driving my ship. Fire him." People laugh at that today. But the fact is, if you're in our profession, luck as a perception is a very important thing. If you have a lucky commander, you're happy to be with him. Look at the generals we've gone through to get to portray us. Sounds like shades of the Civil War till we got to Grant. The generals that came before Petraeus, as good as they might have been, were failures in a system that's designed to make winners. The leadership that took us to war has failed. This place is a hothouse of building leaders for tomorrow, as are all of its sister schools. You can't opt out. That's the deal. The deal is you can't opt out. You got to be in it and fighting about it, even if you disagree. You can't just say, "I'm not going to let it be around me," especially with the background that this place has. I don't understand why it can't be.
And I think for those students who are studying in the Ivies who are not going to end up in military service, there's got to be ways to connect students in different disciplines with opportunities to interact with veterans or military folks. I mean, a lot of that happens here at some of the graduate schools, as already been mentioned. And a lot of the programs would probably be not what they are if they didn't have the military folks there, in terms of numbers and in terms of what they bring. But in undergrads, a lot of undergraduate programs around the country, and I'm sure Harvard is the same way, have required service things that they require their students to do. So, why not find ways to connect them up with the VA, with other opportunities like that where they can, that are related to their fields. Let's say they're sociology majors, psychology majors, they want to find, that they help them to get into some of these places, or the hospitals. If you go into a military hospital like Walter Reed, or even some of the VA centers around here that have wounded warriors that come from one of those major medical centers after they've gotten to a certain point, I don't think you can bring students in that environment and have them talk with those folks and have them walk out the same way. I just don't think you can do it. I think they're going to go and they're going to talk to folks and they're going to find out they're real people with dreams and aspirations, and then they're going to walk away saying the stereotypes I've had or the things I didn't know, I can't do that anymore. I have to get engaged. I have to find out because I'm a responsible citizen. So there are other ways, I think, to get folks involved if the university community is serious about it.
Your true colors. This came up in our discussion. My concern is that since the Vietnam War, a lot of what is driving. I think that a lot of what is driving the distance from the military at this point is Harvard's. It's very much what Professor Moore was talking about this morning. It's unexamined arrogance, and that has a lot of relationship to classism, and it just makes me sick to say that, because classism is so much about a dismissing of the dignity of other human beings, to say you are just simply less than because of your social status. And I think that's one of the last great unexamined sins in this country. Like I said, it makes me sick to say it, but I think that is, the people here don't need to listen, and they don't care to listen, and they don't need to listen because of privilege.
See, I look at that in the opposite way. I don't have such a bad view of that. People who have been the leaders of our nation have felt an obligation despite their class. Look at Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's one of here, right? Okay? His was an obligation to serve despite his illnesses. And sure, he had a good time, and you read a wonderful book of the biography, No Ordinary Time, Pulitzer Prize winner. Terrific dialogue. But the point of it all is the people I've met who are who believe themselves to be of standing in families have a sense of obligation in many instances. And those who don't have jobs at Wall Street anymore. So, there's what goes around comes around. But there's a whole, and they need to be recognized and celebrated for what they've done. We learn it in faith. We learn it in family. And sometimes we have trouble still recognizing it. We learn it in the Corps as a culture. The idea that I'm a better person because I tried to be a good Marine, tried to be good at being a chaplain, tried to reach beyond myself for something grander than myself, and in the process made myself better. You all teach that at this university. And I would think that if you didn't, you ought to, because this is the place where it starts. And these are the people who will ultimately lead. And if they don't have that sense, when you watch Eleanor Roosevelt and how she walked around and interacted with the soldiers and set a standard that today others still try to emulate. And she is of this house, just as her husband, and of this society. I really believe there's more good to it. You just got to reach in and tap it. And when you do, the power is immense. And it takes the nation to the next level, and it'll give us all a better sense that our future for the Republic, after all, be of good cheer. This is the longest running democratic experiment in the history of the world. Longest running by any stretch and measure. So let's make it run a little longer.
Can you think of a better way to end the session? Please join me in thanking these superb panelists for this rich discussion tonight.